In today's video, we turn our focus to a case that has both horrified and baffled people across the United Kingdom for more than 2 decades. It is the story of Stephen Akinmurele, a young man who became one of Britain's youngest known serial killers. His crimes were shocking, his choice of victims particularly disturbing, and the ending of his story even more haunting, as justice was never truly carried out in the courts. This is the story of Stephen Akinmurele, the so-called Blackpool serial killer, and how his actions left a stain on a community that still lingers today. Stephen Akinmurele was born in 1978 in Nigeria, but moved to the Isle of Man as a child. The Isle of Man is known for its quiet, almost idyllic atmosphere, a small island where violent crime is rare. For many, it would have been the perfect place to grow up. But even in places of peace, darkness can sometimes fester beneath the surface. Stephen was described as intelligent, quiet, and even charming at times. Teachers noted he was bright in school, and classmates did not see him as a troublemaker. Yet, as he grew older, others noticed that he often appeared withdrawn, detached, and sometimes oddly cold. Small signs that something wasn't right, signs that only became clear in hindsight once the full truth of who he really was came to light. By the mid-90s, Stephen was living in Blackpool, England. Blackpool was a busy seaside town, famous for its attractions and nightlife, but also home to a number of elderly residents living alone. Between 1995 and 1998, a series of disturbing murders began to occur. The victims all seemed to fit a pattern. They were elderly, living alone, vulnerable, and attacked in the place they should have felt safest, their homes. In 1995, 68-year-old Dorothy Harris was found dead in her Blackpool home. She had been strangled. Later that year, 74-year-old Dorothy Scott was killed in almost identical fashion. Their deaths were brutal, and the fact that both victims were elderly women living alone set alarm bells ringing for investigators. It seemed possible that Blackpool had a serial killer in its midst, but at the time, police did not have a suspect they could link to both killings. The following year, in 1996, the terror escalated. Ronald and Margaret Harrison, aged 79 and 78, were murdered in their own home. Once again, the victims were elderly, targeted in their most vulnerable space. The Harrisons had been beaten and strangled, and their home showed signs of robbery. These crimes caused real fear in the community. Elderly residents no longer felt safe, and many began installing extra locks, refusing to open the door to strangers and looking over their shoulders even in daylight. For a while, the killing slowed. But in 1998, police linked another elderly woman's death to the same suspect. Slowly, a picture was emerging. This was a killer who preyed on the weak, who had little regard for human life, and who seemed to show no signs of remorse. The brutality of the attacks shocked detectives, and the fact that the victims were targeted in their own homes made the crime seem all the more sinister. As police pieced together forensic evidence, suspicion began to fall on Stephen Akinmurele. By this point, Stephen was only around 20 years old, far younger than the profile detectives had initially expected. Serial killers who target elderly women are not usually so young, and investigators were unsettled by the possibility that such a young man could be responsible for so much carnage. Yet evidence began to mount. Fingerprints were matched, and witnesses began to recall details that placed him near the crime scenes. When police dug deeper into Stephen's background, they found a troubled young man who had already displayed worrying tendencies. He was arrested in Blackpool in August 1998. At the time of his arrest, the media seized on the shocking story: a 20-year-old suspected of being a serial killer, accused of preying on elderly women. Britain had seen its share of notorious killers, but rarely had someone so young been suspected of so many murders. When questioned, Stephen at first denied everything, but his calm, almost emotionless demeanor made detectives uneasy. It was as if the horrific details of the crimes simply didn't register with him. Later, under pressure, he made partial admissions. To those who questioned him, it was clear they were dealing with someone who did not feel the weight of human life in the way most people do. Stephen was charged with 5 murders and 1 attempted murder. The victims' families waited for the justice system to take its course, but they would never get the trial they hoped for. In August 1999, almost exactly a year after his arrest, Stephen Akinmurele was found dead in his prison cell at Manchester Prison. He had taken his own life by hanging just weeks before his trial was due to begin. He is only 21 years old. The news of his suicide devastated the families of the victims. They had waited years to see him face justice, to hear the evidence laid out in court, and to receive the closure of a proper conviction. Instead, that chance was ripped away. Many relatives spoke out in anger and disbelief. They felt cheated, that Stephen had taken the coward's way out, robbing them of their day in court and leaving too many questions unanswered. The case of Stephen Akinmurele sparked widespread debate in Britain. How could someone so young have developed into a serial killer? Was there something in his upbringing that had gone unnoticed? Or was he simply born with a darkness that no one could have predicted? Mental health experts suggested that he may have suffered from a personality disorder or from underlying psychological problems that had never been properly treated. Some pointed to his quiet, withdrawn demeanor as a sign that he had long struggled with emotions he could not control. But no diagnosis could explain away the brutality of his actions, nor could it bring back the lives that had been lost. The prison service also came under scrutiny. How had such a high-profile inmate, accused of multiple murders, been able to take his own life so easily while in custody? Critics argued that Akinmurele should have been under constant observation, particularly given the seriousness of his alleged crimes and the risk of suicide before trial. Some believed he had deliberately planned his death to avoid facing the shame of a trial and the certainty of a life sentence behind bars. For the people of Blackpool, the story left a permanent scar. The deaths of Dorothy Harris, Dorothy Scott, Ronald and Margaret Harrison, and the other victims cast a long shadow over the town. Neighbors remembered them as gentle, kind, elderly people who had posed no threat to anyone. To think that their final moments were filled with fear and violence was unbearable. Even today, more than 2 decades later, Stephen Akinmurele's name carries with it a sense of horror. He is remembered as one of Britain's youngest serial killers, a man who targeted the most vulnerable and whose actions left behind devastation. His case remains unusual, not only because of his age, but also because of its abrupt and tragic ending. There was no courtroom drama, no lengthy trial, no verdict delivered by a jury. Just a sudden end and silence, leaving families to mourn without answers. The legacy of the case is one of unanswered questions. Could more have been done to spot the signs earlier? Could the prison service have prevented his suicide? And above all, why did a young man like Stephen Akinmurele choose to kill again and again with no apparent remorse? Those questions remain, and they are perhaps the most haunting part of his story. Stephen Akinmurele's story is not just about the murders he committed. It is also about the failures of a system that could not deliver justice in the way families needed. It is about the dangers of overlooking mental health, of failing to intervene when warning signs appear. And it is a chilling reminder that evil can emerge in even the most unexpected places. The families of the victims have always said that their loved ones deserve better. Better safety, better protection, and better justice. And perhaps that is the most important lesson to take away from this story.